This is Red Ice Radio. From the apparent to the esoteric. RedIceCreations.com.
Welcome to Red Ice Radio. It's great to have you all with us. My name is Henrik. Thank you for taking the time to listen and follow along in our program. If you take the time to look around on the website RedIceCreations.com, you'll see we have more than just radio. But just click into our archive, a year of radio programs with no commercials, for free, at your convenience to stream or download. All our second hour interviews are archived in our members area. Today we're going to discuss the history of education, the school industry, indoctrination, the systematic dumbing down of children and social engineering, together with John Taylor Gatto. He was named the New York State Teacher of the Year in 1991 when he decided to quit. He refused the award and instead used his stage time to discuss exactly how the state was paying him to damage children. John calls it state-controlled consciousness, a form of government adoption, and he's been writing and speaking about this since '91. His books include Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling, The Exhausted School, A Different Kind of Teacher, The Underground History of American Education, a school teacher's intimate investigation into the problem of modern schooling. And his latest one is called Weapons of Mass Instruction, a school teacher's journey through the dark world of compulsory schooling. Gatto is currently at work on a documentary film about the nature of modern schooling entitled The Fourth Purpose. The website where you can find more information is johntaylorgatto.com. Stay with us for the next 2 hours. It is with great pleasure that we welcome you to the program. It's great to have you with us, and thank you for taking the time to talking with us here today, John.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, of course, as I mentioned, you are the author of Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling, and your latest book is called Weapons of Mass Instruction, a school teacher's journey through the dark world of compulsory schooling. And we have so much to discuss here today, John. You've had about 26 years of experience and frustration with the public school system. And unfortunately, as far as I know, as far as I'm concerned from my point of view, you are a lone voice out there speaking out against, I guess we could say the violence against children, John, all across the world for forcing them to have to go through school. But to kind of begin our conversation here, John, why don't we talk a little bit about the history of education? I mean, obviously, in one form or another, this is as old as mankind itself. But maybe you can briefly tell us about the history of school as it is in its current form, John, and who is behind schooling.
I think the key question back at the beginning of time, long before I have anywhere, has always been, to what extent do you turn over the education of the young to the young and their immediate surroundings, and to what extent do you centralize it in the hands of either the most powerful or what you consider to be the most expert? And back and forth through history, this wrestling match has taken place. What seems to have happened at about the time economies became industrialized was the centralization began to win, with the interesting and notable exception of the education of the managerial classes, which was kept free and is kept free to some extent. The rest of the population has been indoctrinated more than educated. Schooled is a fine word because we all know what a school of fish is, and that's not a loose use of language. The kids are to become predictable so they can be employed as human resources. You can't extend that to everybody because, as Darwin demonstrated in the middle of the 19th century, organisms that can adapt to new situations perish. So somebody has to be left with their mind open to take into account changes in the world, but everyone else is in a sense at their mercy. Now, the most fascinating thing to me is that through history, the great names that we all know worldwide, certainly in Europe and the United States, but I think worldwide, have offered different justifications to do this. I mean, we have very early on religious justifications. This is the way God wants it. And then we have in the secular enlightenment of ancient Athens, Plato's justification that people are permanently superior, average, or inferior, and there's nothing can be done about that. Hence the word education is meaningless. They have to be cultivated and conditioned so they won't get in the way of the people who make things happen. Now, if we move up a little bit further in history to the great Protestant reformer of Christianity, John Calvin, in the 1500s, Calvin clearly establishes that prior to our birth, some of us are selected for salvation. That's a tiny fraction. Everyone else is doomed. And so Calvin, in his great institutes, worth anyone's time to read, spells out from a lawyerly perspective how you're to take the damned, who are 90 or 95% of the population, fill their minds with nonsense, set them into daily competition with one another so they'll never step back and say, why are we doing this? Obviously, we're doing this to win. And that way, the damned can be kept out of the way of the elect. But if you move a little bit farther into your part of the world, in Holland, the great so-called liberal philosopher Spinoza, writing in 1690, says very, very clearly that most people are in fact damned, but Spinoza's an atheist, so he doesn't mean that religiously. He says they are murderously irrational, and there's no cure for that. And since there's so few of the rational left to manage them, they have to be taught to manage themselves by being stripped of their ability to think clearly and set into competition with one another. And we're not done yet. In your part of the world, 125 years after Spinoza, the great Prussian philosopher Johann Fichte writes public letters to the King of Prussia demanding that ordinary children be drawn out of their homes and their neighborhoods and put under the control of employees of the state. And Fichte is crystal clear where they are to be taught half-truths and imperfect information, where their natural abilities are to be modified downward so they'll never get in the way of the managers. Now, we can take that right up to today. It's what changes is the language that's used. The intention is identical. The justifications change a little bit. Let me do one final one and then put myself back in your hands. When the agrarian economies of the 19th century in the United States gave way to industrial economies. And in your part of the world, that happened a half to a century earlier. When that happened, some great change had to be imposed on ordinary people used to getting up in the morning, going out in the sunshine, or in your part of the world in the gloom, whatever, but get fresh air in either case. Now you've got to get them into factories, sitting at machines. So how are you going to do that? Their parents will resist this. You have to get an institution going that'll draw the young away from their parents, drain them out of the whole community, and accustom them to sitting in chairs, listening to orders, listening to bells, etc. So in my country, the great industrialists, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Vincent Astor, there's probably another half dozen I could name, got together and put their shoulders to the political wheel of establishing this for the first time in American history as law. You must surrender your children. And from a modest beginning of a few hours a day, it grew and it grew and it grew and extended itself into year after year. Now in my country, there's frequent talk of cradle to grave schooling, which must be the ultimate torment. In fact, Immanuel Kant said that tutelage is the worst torture, and lifelong tutelage is, that's for the books.
It's an incredible elitist point of view that you're, painting for us here, John, as we go back into history. Basically an ideology that states in one way or another, we are better than you, so you should be the subjects of us and our agenda and so forth. But again, the question goes back to this idea of how do you think they managed to get away with this, taking the young children away from families and taking on to themselves the responsibility, at least officially, to teach children about the world instead of the parents?
You can see in the purest, simplest form, you do it by coercion. And certainly we have ample record of that. But coercion has limits that simple people don't understand. As Hegel taught the ruling classes of Europe in the 19th century, coercion inevitably leads to an underground determined to overthrow coercion. And since history has no continuous governments, the underground always succeeds. At some point, even the dimmest bulbs came to see there has to be a better way than coercion. And fortunately, some Russian lunatic discovered the reflex arc in Pavlov. Mm-hmm. The bells and the dog salivating. That spread electrically through the world. It galvanized the ruling classes of the world, seeing that if you could habit train and attitude train early enough, people would become their own jailers. But marching through history, when coercion wore out, God's will took over. And that was a more effective, and in combination with coercion, a deadly effective way of brainwashing the masses, when ultimately that wore out in the period of rationality, the Rousseau and the others in the Enlightenment, they figured out that it would have to be done psychologically. And the early capitalist philosophers saw that you could do it by appealing to greed, that if you only submit to this discipline will take care of you later on. And the people who submit best will be best taken care of. The great villain, though, in human history, and I mean in terms of corpses, is a supremely wealthy, gentle Englishman named Charles Darwin. Mm-hmm. Because in his second big book, not Origin of Species, but The Descent of Man, which appeared in Europe in 1871, Darwin said very, very clearly that most of the human race is not evolving, that they're dead ends. And furthermore, and his corollary was brutal, furthermore, if the good stuff, and I do believe he mentioned Scandinavian blondes, intermarries with the bad stuff, that's my people down in Italy or in Spain, evolution will march backwards, into the swirling mists of the dawnless path. This was ultimately the revolution in human thinking that led to Nazi Germany's brutality. Hell, is very clear that he's following Darwinian instructions. But more than that, all over the world, the massacres in the Soviet Union were Darwinian-inspired massacres.
Yeah.
Our treatment of the American Indian and of the African black brought to America slaves, the minute Darwin was available, the other justifications vanished, because here was the pinnacle of science speaking. These people are clear and present danger to the good breeding stuff. And while Darwin remained a gentle, wealthy person all his life, his first cousin, Francis Galton, was extremely aggressive and set up clubs and debating societies all over the planet, including in Japan, that tried to reform the national life so that it made it difficult for ordinary people to crossbreed with the good stuff. Let me give you a specific example of that. Mm-hmm. We're all familiar with elite private boarding schools, but what has remained a matter of great ignorance is that while a few of them survive from medieval times and kings, the vast majority, well over 90%, appear in the 20 years after Charles Darwin's Descent of Man. If you say 30 years, you're talking about 95% of the elite boarding schools on planet Earth appear in this zone because they're storing the good breeding stock there. And keeping temptation, some dashing Italian from winking at a Swedish girl or whatever. That's the end of the world as we know it.
So, John, in your mind, there's no doubt that this is a conspiracy by the few to subjugate the rest of humanity under their control.
I want to avoid the word conspiracy, partly because we're all forbidden to use it, even though there has not been a single day in American government history where the government is suing somebody for conspiracy. Let me say that the natural self-interest of like-minded people will explain just about everything. What they learned through history was not to wave swords around and insult the lesser peoples, but to cajole them and say this is for your own good, to turn mothers and fathers against their children and vice versa. I mean, isn't a good citizen someone who cooperates with the schools? I mean, this is profound insanity, but it's been brought about by psychological mastery,
Yeah.
the distilled wisdom of armies in the field and from every part of history, from church life, wherever it's occurred. If you read old theology books, they're essentially textbooks in practical psychology, how to get what you want by pressing the right psychological buttons. So if you put aside the faith-based component, they're really marvelously detailed manuals on how to mislead people into being their own worst enemies.
Absolutely. I mean, John, I want to ask you about this. We hear stories all the time of, deprived children in third world countries and so forth, and how important it is for us in the West to give money, to donate, to help in any way we can, to help to give them the same wonderful education system that we have, that they deserve to have the same opportunities as we do. And it's now considered to be kind of a virtue, if you will, to help to spread this violence and this system to the rest of the world, John.
Well, let me attribute that. In any case that I attribute an effect to one cause. Obviously, if we had a week to talk, there are multiple causes, but the academic cause for that was a simultaneous discovery in late 19th century Italy by two, I'll call them sociologists, but I'm not sure that term existed then, two Italian public thinkers who operated independently of one another, but simultaneously hit on an explanation why no government in human history had managed to perpetuate itself for very long without being overthrown. And they came to the conclusion that independently again, that the people abused and exploited by these governments did what Hegel said they would do. They worked out ways to sabotage the ruling power and overthrow it, and then the whole procedure started again. So both Pareto, it's Vilfredo Pareto, and John Battista Mosca independently said the proper way to perpetuate a managerial class, a ruling order, is to draw away the children from the underclasses and sort through them and find the ones likeliest to become leaders, and then to seduce them with the privileges of the managerial class. And of course, what you say to the parents is, Rolf is really so far in advance of his classmates. We'd like to send him. We'll pay all the expenses to this private boarding school where he'll learn to be a leader and not a follower. And how can you resist that? And then if you move down the school ranks, there are lesser ways to say the same thing. We're going to transfer him to a better class, or move him from one school to another because he's so superior. But it's chastening and at the same time brilliantly enlightening to go to these primary sources, which of course are in every good library in Europe and the United States, and actually see the ideas form that then are transferred into an institutional form.
Absolutely, and I mean, it's an ingenious philosophy, if you will, that has been playing out now then for a long time. And considering some of these latest things that you mentioned about the two Italian sociologists and so forth, does that mean that the form of government that we have currently, and in cahoots with that we have the corporate world, of course, and other factions as well, but does that to you mean that they are invincible? Are they now in a position where we, the people, in that sense, won't be able to overthrow them, do you think?
Well, It's a wonderful question, and I wish we had a pitcher of beer or iced tea, whatever. You know, let me say this: that in 1640, so 371 years ago, an advisor to the British king by the name of Thomas Hobbes wrote a book that will be in every university library in Sweden and probably in most of the public libraries, called the Leviathan. It was advice to the king, who now had the technology at hand to build a gigantic state. I mean, prior to the 17th century, you certainly had powerful political states, but the reach beyond the king went 20 or 30 miles. As far as the cavalry and the army could easily move, that's where the king was king. You know, beyond that, people said, yeah, the king, right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't have any tax money for you. But in 1640, Thomas Hobbes, wrote to the king specific instructions about how to hold together a diverse, complex state. And he said, if I say the first thing, that's my own ordering, but the first thing in my mind, he said, is that where the power actually is has to be concealed from the people, because otherwise, as opposition grows, the people's force will be directed against, you know, the right villain. He said, so what we have to have is in the church, in the government, in the military, figureheads in all the public positions, and the power being displaced so it's unreachable by a spasm of anger on the part of the people. I know that's been done in the American presidency. I mean, just recently, I have no brief one way or another. We have a two-party system, and one party that calls itself the Democrats is in the White House now and in many of the state houses. But in truth, an examination of the policies for the last 50 years show that not only are both parties very much identical, the families intermarry, but in addition to them being identical, the same groups contribute to the success of both parties.
That's right.
So that the news, well, someone from Scandinavia, the WikiLeaks fellow, has been doing, I think, human sanity a great favor by simply allowing you to draw your own conclusions about the motives of the people who make decisions. One thing certain is none of the narratives that are spoken to your people or to mine are in fact accurate. They've been devised in order to be psychologically palatable. You know, and I don't know how old you are, and I don't need to know, but I'm 75, and I grew up during the Second World War, where the enemy had an army, a navy, and an air force. And they were pretty tough. Now we make wars against people with no army, no navy, no air force, no economy to speak of, no shoes, people whose prime weapons are to blow up their underwear and their feet. You know what I mean.
Right.
I mean, what's sold to the general public as political necessity is a show put on to keep an increasingly dysfunctional economy beating on all fours. Look at the American economy. I don't know how the Swedish economy works, but the American economy at the very top has hamburger made out of noses, ears, eyeballs, feet, out of parts of the animal that never were used by many people in the past. This is the prime employer, and it's tied with so-called big box stores. I'm sure they're over there, but here they're Walmart and stores like that, which essentially are sheds filled with merchandise from the last few economies in the world that maintain an overt slave class, like China. And India.
Yeah.
And maybe that's too crude, but I think the truth of it isn't hard to see. Our third form of income is building weaponry, and bombs and bullets, and selling it to both sides in every conflict on Earth. How on earth has this been concealed from a population that isn't the dumbest in the world? Without American, and you guys do a pretty good job too, but without Americans arms manufacturers, I mean, the wars of the earth would be fought with sticks and stones and slingshots. And from a capitalist point of view, what a marvelous commodity that destroys itself in the use.
Well, exactly. You have to build, continue to produce, obviously. And just as you say, John, Sweden is a big weapons manufacturer, by the way. But also on top of that, the propaganda then that we're getting in the news, maybe even now, who knows what is happening in the school system itself when it comes to the justification of these wars that you're talking about. But as it is right now, John, this is what is happening in Libya and other places of the world, North Africa and Middle East. This is because we're doing that out of the goodness of our heart to spread the wonderful system of democracy to the rest of the world, to these deprived countries again, John. So this behavior is justified.
The public narrative, and since the newspapers, the television stations, the radio stations resonates this official picture, and dissent is kept way out on the fringe. And if dissent enters the public attention, it's always over some minor point, like, shall we send 300,000 troops or 200,000 troops? Meanwhile, our nation is as bankrupt as it's possible to be. And the rest of our economy is equally dysfunctional. We produce the fantasies for the rest of the world. I've been asked a half a dozen times to speak in China. And what I notice is that not only does every Chinese I meet from any social class speak English as well as Chinese, which worries me a little bit, but half of them are playing American computer games. And so help me God, this is a true story. The last time I was there last year in what used to be called Canton and now is Guangzhou, I became desperate to escape the American fast foods and American movies, and I said to the hotel, tell me where there's a tea house. And they said there's one down on the Pearl River, and I walked about 5 blocks down the hill, got to the tea house, got in, and was just delighted. There were 50 pages of different teas. I said, now I'm in China, 5,000 years of tradition. And as I was sipping my tea, it suddenly struck me that of the 1,000 other customers in this outdoor tea house, no one was speaking. And it took me, I'm slow, but what's going on? And then I noticed their heads were all inclined at about a 30-degree angle upward, and I looked up, and there was the largest television screen that my imagination could have. I mean, if I say it's as big as a city block, it was enormous. And what's playing on television? 2 American professional basketball teams are playing.
Yeah.
That's what I'm in, this ancient civilization, and this clientele of a tea house is watching American professional basketball.
This is globalization at its best, John. In that sense, it's a worldwide culture, if you will, now, and it's inescapable almost around the world.
Well, that's of course a bulwark of our economy, creating both pure fantasy as entertainment and also professional sports. We're desperately trying to spread professional football to you guys now. I think they have one or two games a year in England every year, but the intention is to draw all you health nuts playing soccer into a game where your brain can get scrambled pretty good.
Yeah, it's incredible. I want to ask you a little bit more about the idea of a war economy as well. And I know that we're micro studying certain aspects in history. We try to connect the whole picture here, as you very well have done, John, so far. But how do you see this the whole post World War II agenda of getting everybody in a household to go to work, for instance, instead of just one paycheck being enough to support an entire family? And this is the lie, obviously, as well of women being liberated from the system. I mean, this is just about further enslavement. If you ask me, this is not about.
It's the enslavement of the family.
Right.
If we jump back to 1908, which is a little over 100 years ago, my information, by the way, comes from Johns Hopkins University, doing a study about 10 years ago. In 1908. The purchasing power of the median worker's income is equal to, in 1990, the purchasing power of a median working couple's income. In other words, by drawing, is it exactly what Adam Smith, the economist, would have told you? By doubling the size of the so-called workforce, you will cut the value of labor in half. That's what's happened.
That's right.
So you get two for the price of one, and look at the other advantage you get. Not just cheaper labor. You get the children detached from any form of guidance which might deter them from swallowing the government line, hook, line, and sinker, as we say in the United States. You remove the influence of the family. Now when the kid sees the parents, they're tired, they may be grumpy, they need rest of some sort. This is part of, once again, I don't mean to improve of it, a brilliant piece of social engineering put together, assembled in the burgeoning university culture of the late 19th century. And if I trace this back most recently in history to Prussia, one of 160 little countries in what used to be called the Germanies, who kicked the devil out of France in 1871, Darwin's year, and unified Germany shortly afterwards into Germany. Prussia used schooling deliberately for this purpose, to remove competition from the state mandates. The competition in the form of religion as well as the family, in the form of tradition. Training would be put under command of the state, and of course the economy would follow. We hear over and over again in the States, I think you'll get a kick out of this. We have heard repeatedly for the past 20 or 30 years, that without a college diploma, opportunity simply is so vastly reduced that no one who could escape this condition wouldn't do so. Well, I took a look at the creators of our very successful information technology industry, and I found Bill Gates had no college degree. I found that Steve Jobs of Apple had no college degree. I found that Michael Dell of Dell Computer had no college degree, and that the partners of these people had no college degrees when they were becoming moguls. One or two got a degree later on so that they could teach school. You know, the Ted Turner, the only creator of an international television network so far, said college was a waste of time, that the man who invented automobile rental at airports, Warren Avis, said college was a waste of time. And we could go quite a bit further than that, and we can even go into the sciences. The head of the Human Genome Project, the co-head, Francis Collins, not only was homeschooled with a mother who let him select anything he wanted to study, and he studied it for as long as he wanted, and science wasn't one of the things he selected. He's one half of the Human Genome Project, and the other half is a fellow who was a D- student in high school, cut class all the time, graduated only because the teachers hated him so much they raised his F average to a D. This is the most vaunted scientific project on the face of the earth. So we have been sold a massive bill of goods. And right up until, who knows, 10 years ago, right up until the rise of China and the wising up of Malaysia, and to some extent Japan was the pioneer because the war forced her into the Western orbit. These people bring a slightly different intelligence to the table, a much different history, and if the idea is to divide and conquer in order that management rests easy on the throne, then they have a lot more experience doing that thousands of years than the United States or Sweden does.
I mean, John, I think it's a very interesting point that you make in terms of some of these people who either dropped out of school and never almost attended at all, or they were failing students and so forth. And I think that on one level, this has been allowed, if you will, as well, meaning these people were allowed to do this. For instance, some of the names that you mentioned earlier on there, in terms of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, the Apple's Steve Jobs, they were people who were, in some regard, they were slamming LSD. They were in the hippie movement at the time, and and actually, these people were, I believe, allowed to be creative. If you imagine that the system, John, is so dead in itself, it understands that it needs to have innovative thinking to come into it sometimes, creativity.
I'm certain you're right. Let me give you a piece of evidence for that.
Yeah.
I can't give you specifics because I had to sign a contract saying I wouldn't, but I have been invited to speak in China half a dozen times over the last 5 years. I always have to sign a contract, but Apple Computer made me sign the same contract. The details would not be released, but essentially what I'm hired to do, and I've been hired in other Asiatic countries, they're worried that their tremendous leap forward has come from simply stealing patents and copyrights without any compensation, and it's worked well, but they know they can't be integrated into the family of trading nations unless they generate their own imaginative connections, secrets of nature, all that stuff. So they want to know how to do that. And I say the same thing in general. Every place I'm asked the question, I said, you cannot divide time into these measured segments. You cannot tell people what they have to think about and when they're going to be tested on whether they've done that. You can't do all the things that provide the framework of your culture and expect people to be creative. I can tell you this, the Chinese kids who immigrate to the United States, and they're now first generation, are explosively creative. It's just that it's been suppressed for quite a long, long time. But the American kids have, they've been dulled down. I invented a phrase that Harvard gave me credit for 2 years ago. About 20 years ago, I'm looking at my classes, and they're drawn from prosperous families, and I can see that by the time they're in secondary school, their minds are about at the stage that my generation was. I don't mean to exaggerate here. In third or fourth grade, and I grew up in a coal mining, steelworking town in western Pennsylvania during World War II. I mean, we read Marcus Aurelius and Julius Caesar in 5th and 6th grade.
Wow.
And then in 9th grade, we reread them in Latin. That was 1946.
Yeah.
We were excited about ideas. And these kids are, the only thing that excites them is getting home in time to see the latest chapter of a television series.
Yeah.
And I said, what excites you about that? You can write the script yourself. I used to run exercises. I'd say, okay, here are the first 3 scenes. Now what's the 4th scene? Invariably they know. And the 5th scene, and how's this going to end up? They know how it's going to end up.
Well, it's incredible, John. I mean, what is happening then, do you think? Is it just the technology, if you will, that have put a cap on children's and everybody's
it's a part of it. I think you and I both have encountered enough kids who use the technology creatively that it's not an inherent necessity that the technology do that. But if you impose a condition of continuous boredom especially on people who are intellectually gifted, they flee for relief to junk, to pornography. I don't need to tell you that most of the use of the internet is to go to pornographic sites, and who knows? If I wasn't 75, I might do the same thing. But seriously, that's what drug use is really about. Anyone who's ever been intoxicated by ideas knows that stronger stimulants really have a minor or no place at all that you can, I'm 75, I can't wait to wake up in the morning to figure out what I'm going to learn from some great mind who lived before me, or from somebody now. But what the technology has allowed is for the managerial classes, let me call them, to create a profile, a book on every living citizen. I'm sure your press has let you know over the last 30 days to what extent Google preserves every decision you make all your life and the location you were in and the time of day that you made it.
Yeah.
So in a funny sense, they know more than you. The American government is trying to sit on the testimony of a computer scientist in Washington a month ago. I've been energetically trying to get a copy of the transcript and have been put off by agencies. Somebody from the University of California, in league with a computer guy from the University of Washington, demonstrated before a government bureau that it is possible not only to overhear any conversation made inside of a car or truck built over the last 3 years. From thousands of miles away, you can hear the conversation, but it's quite possible very easily to override the gas pedal and the brake. Do you recall the great contretemps, was it a year ago, 2 years ago, that almost destroyed Toyota?
Oh, yeah.
The accelerations, well, these guys demonstrated how easy it is to do, and it doesn't require much computer savvy to do it.
Hacking the car, if you will. That's what you're talking about.
Hacking the car so it becomes either a death trap or, an eavesdropping salon.
That's incredible. And again, that's an extension of some of the things that I want to continue to talk more with you about in the next hour in terms of what the student is being turned into if we tie it back to the school system again, because we know about all the cameras that are going in now. They're changing what the kids are going to eat at lunch. There's a number of things that are interesting that are happening and unfolding. But I think that we should take a little break here between the segment, John, because this is a good time to do that. But let's give people out there, obviously, more information about your website. I know that you personally are not, online, if you will, but you do have a website and you do have a lot of information out there. So why don't you mention that and some of your book titles as well, John?
If anyone would like my books or would like to invite me to speak in Sweden, one of the two, my website is johntaylorgatto.com. Taylor's Taylor, and Gatto's GATTO, and my email there is info@. About 3 years ago, I found that the amount of communication that I got through the website was impossible to respond to. So I personally, even though the benefits of the internet are quite obvious, I didn't know how to deal with the other part, and since I have what they call an addictive personality where Scotch whiskey is concerned, probably should be aquavit, right? I just decided the simplest thing to do. If you want to write me directly, I always respond. And my address is 235 West 76th Street. That's a 7 and a 6. New York City, New York, 10023. By the way, about 20 years ago, a Norwegian film team came to my class and did a long documentary for a Norwegian show called Half After 6. The director's name was Sven Erik Borgia, and I'm sure you could probably get a copy of that from as I understand it, there's only one television network in Norway, although that may have changed in the intervening time. But you'd be able to see my kids in action.
All right. Interesting. I was actually looking for that, John, online, both for, after the program, and searched a little bit for the filmmaker as well, and I could not, unfortunately, not find it online. But it could be that the Norwegian, their state-owned, television network has, copies of it still. I need to look into that, but I haven't been able to find it online. But you have a number of other videos, of course, up on both YouTube and Video Google that we recommend to people, and we're going to link some of those up as well.
Yes, feel free to use anything you find, because my great pleasure at this stage of my life is just stimulating the conversation. I have a great faith in the innate intelligence of ordinary people who mow the grass and go fishing and walk the dog and burp the baby. I think they have deliberately all over the world been dumbed down, but that doesn't mean they can't reinvigorate their minds.
Absolutely. I think you're 100% right on that, John. And also, just want to mention the book titles here before we wrap things up with the first hour. Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. And your latest one is called Weapons of Mass Instruction, A School Teacher's Journey Through the Dark World of Compulsory Schooling. And they are available.
You can buy those both on the website.
That's right. We will link those up as well from redicecreations.com, John. But stay with us. Thank you very much for this first hour. We will continue with more in the second coming up. In the next hour, we begin to talk about camera surveillance and privacy invasion in schools. Nowadays, the mind is open for inspection. School is not for everyone, and John talks about the hothouse of social dynamics that occur for children at schools, and why concentration is not possible in that environment. He talks about school as a laboratory, a place that divides people and places them in the social order. Then we address homeschooling, how homeschooling has been made illegal in both Sweden and Germany. We also discuss examples in history of young children and teens that have risen to incredible heights without schooling, as well as successful adults that have no college education. In fact, their success seems to be because they haven't gone through the indoctrination system as most people. We later discuss Montessori schools, the Waldorf school system of Rudolf Steiner as well. John also talks about the redundancy in studying subject areas which only lead to memorizing facts and becomes pointless. Rather, we should, as they did in the old times, teach children the art of reasoning and rhetoric so that they may be able to understand for themselves and critically argue and think on their own. This next segment is for our members. Log in or sign up at our website redicecreations.com to stream or download this next hour. Stay with us for another enlightening hour together with John Taylor Gatto. We have a lot more programs coming up on Red Eyes Radio. Some great guests, for example, David Warner Matheson, Dennis McKenna, William Bramley, Meron Keshe, John Anthony Hill, Scott Onstott, Christopher Dunn, Josh Reeves, Jurelina, Max Egan, Adrian Silbucci, Henrik Macau, Gilad Atzmon, Israel Shamir, and others. But right now, we'll proceed with John in the members area.